welcome to a session on literary criticism and theory. We will begin our module 2. We will start with Sir Philip Sidney and his An Apology for Poetry. So in this video, we will talk briefly about the life of Sir Philip Sidney, one of the major poets of the 16th century, and in more detail, we shall talk about the chief work, An Apology for Poetry, which is of course prescribed for your course of study. Sir Philip Sidney was a courtier, a soldier, a statesman, a scholar, and also a distinguished poet of the 16th century. He lived during the Elizabethan age, and so he was a contemporary of Shakespeare. We should also recall, or we should also bear in mind, that when we speak about the Elizabethan age, it is really the English Renaissance that we are speaking about. The English Renaissance begins in Italy and makes it to England during the age of Elizabeth. In the essay, An Apology for Poetry, he explores the core concepts and answers to earlier criticism of poetry. We shall first discuss how he praises poetry for being the cradle of civilization, for being the channel of divine power, for teaching us as well as delighting us, and for combining and surpassing the virtues of history and philosophy. After that, we shall move on to show how he refutes or goes against the main arguments made against poetry. That is, the reason for writing this essay itself was because of a person named Stephen Gosson, who wrote a treatise against poetry. So he tells us later in the essay, he speaks about or gives out various arguments to tell us as to why he defends Philip Sidney, why he defends poetry, and what Stephen Gosson or where Stephen Gosson has gone wrong by criticizing poetry, or his arguments against poetry, Stephen Gosson's arguments against poetry. We shall come to that very soon. But before that, you must understand that in order to have a total understanding of this essay, we need to travel back in time. It is not just today that people, or even now, people wonder whether poetry is worthwhile. Even you have heard it, right? When you took BA English, many people asked, or many people consider it as something which is they look at it in a very derogatory way. They look at it in a way that, oh, it's a course that is taken by people who are not good in art, in science and maths. They, however, fail to understand the value of literature. So here you have poetry, especially when it comes to poetry, people often wondered that poetry, or people often have stated that poetry is something that is not worthwhile. It has always had its critics. Like all critics before him, Sidney knew that he would also have to answer not only the contemporary attacks, but also the attacks on poetry that was laid down in the past. So here he takes a bold step. He comes out and boldly justifies or speaks for poetry. So poetry has always been criticized as worthless, as something which can lead people astray, people into wild imagination, and then they go astray. So these were the things, or these were the attacks on poetry. Now Plato, you would be studying Plato, you have heard of Plato. Plato is the teacher of Aristotle, and Aristotle is great. He has written several works on defending poetry and defending art, especially his Poetics, which you would be studying very soon. But remember, Plato was against poetry. Plato was a good administrator. He spoke about administration, he spoke about the ideal state, and Plato wanted to banish all the poets from the ideal state. According to Plato, poets were considered as people who would lead, or poets would lead the people, the citizens, astray. They would become lazy, they would become they would indulge in too much of greed and cause a lot of trouble. So Plato wanted the poets to be banished. So he's not just giving or answering to the contemporary attacks on poetry, but also he's answering to the attacks made by the ancestors, the people in the past, the critics or the classic writers who have criticized poetry from Plato onwards. Okay. Now, during Sidney's time, remember again, the criticism, actually the literary criticism actually begins with Philip Sidney, the real criticism. That's something that you have to understand. During Sidney's time, there was no standard model of literary criticism. Sidney's predecessors in this field of criticism, they did not have a perfect vision. It was mostly based on, or they cannot be considered as full-fledged critics. There was Wilson, there was Roger Ascham, then Thomas Elliott, not T.S. Eliot, Thomas Elliott, E-L-Y-O-T, Sir Thomas Elliott. All these people were also critics before Sidney, but they cannot be considered or regarded as full-fledged critics, because their discussions or their literary criticisms were mostly blurred, did not have any clarity. Sidney, on the other hand, Philip Sidney, on the other hand, could see much more clearly than his contemporaries. He is the first critic of English literature. Okay, I want you to put that in your mind. Sir Philip Sidney is the first critic of English literature, and real criticism began in England with Sir Philip Sidney. So in this way, he is an innovator who broke away from early critical traditions, and he created something of his own. Okay. Now, if you look at the past writings, so I'm not speaking about the period with Philip Sidney, I'm speaking about the period before Philip Sidney, right from Geoffrey Chaucer onwards. You know who Geoffrey Chaucer is. Geoffrey Chaucer is considered the father of English literature, and of the 14th century, he is a person who is responsible for bringing or giving us English language, or reviving English language back to its purity. He brought back English language back to its purity. He started writing in English. Okay, so Geoffrey Chaucer can be considered the father of English language, English literature, and but even Chaucer also had a critical spirit in him. There was a critical spirit in him. That critic lay hidden inside him, but somehow it did not find the proper trajectory. It did not find the proper outlet. And in 1473, the next person was Richard de Bury. So there's another person, Richard de Bury, published the original Latin version of Philobiblon, a treatise that existed in 1281, between 1281, which was perhaps written between 1281 and 1345. So this was published, which was in Latin. This was translated and this was published, in 1473 by Richard de Bury. But however, that too was not very appropriate. It was a weak attempt, and it had a narrow outlook towards criticism. The next person was William Caxton. You have heard of William Caxton, the printing press. And William Caxton is the first literary icon of the 15th century England, and he showed some critical significance in his prefaces to the works or to the books he chose for printing. So he had an aesthetic taste, and therefore we can consider him as the first impressionistic, or his critical observations. Whose critical observations? William Caxton's. William Caxton's critical observations can be considered as the first impressionistic appreciations in the history of English literary criticism, because he had a fine taste. He chose, or he showed some critical significances in the prefaces to the books he chose for printing. He had an aesthetic taste, and also the books that he chose showed that he had a critical observation. Okay, and therefore we can consider him as the first impressionistic appreciation, his observations as the first impressionistic appreciations in the history of English literary criticism. Next in line is Sir Thomas Elliott. Now, Sir Thomas Elliott who lived between 1490 and 1546. I'm not speaking about T.S. Eliot here. Again, it is Sir Thomas Elliott. You would be, since you are in second year, you don't get confused with T.S. Eliot and Sir Thomas Elliott. This is Eliot, E-L-Y-O-T, who lived during the 15th century, that is between 1490 and 1546. He also wrote a book called The Book Named The Governor, but even that book lacked a deep critical insight. It was vague. Okay. Next we have Roger Ascham. Roger Ascham was a school teacher, and he strongly advocated the use of English. In his book Taxophilus, he strongly advocated the use of English, pure English language only, and he, since he was a purist, he totally disapproved the introduction of foreign words into English language. See, English language, you have foreign words in English language. You have English language is a mix of Latin, of it has the Scandinavian hues, it has the Celtic words, it has French words, yes, Latin words, Greek words. So it's not a pure kind of language. It is a mix of all these foreign words. But Roger Ascham, he disapproved of this. He was a purist, and he totally disapproved the introduction of foreign words into English language. In Schoolmaster, in his work, another work, Schoolmaster, he goes against poetry. So there also you can't bring him as a critical, or he cannot be considered a true critic. So he goes against poetry. He shows an affinity with the poet haters of the time. He was very much close to those people who hated poetry of the time. Then you have Thomas Wilson. Thomas Wilson, as I mentioned earlier in the video, Thomas Wilson's The Art of Rhetoric can be regarded as the first modern treatise on English composition. Who's Thomas Wilson's The Art of Rhetoric, which was published in 1553. But again, all these books failed. It still failed because it could not bring justice to poetry. It could not answer several criticisms or several attacks on hurled against poetry. Why poetry? What is its use? What are its advantages? More than the advantages, they spoke about the disadvantages. So none of these people above spoken earlier could bring justice to poetry. And it was Philip Sidney, in his apology, An Apology for Poetry, that truly brought justice to poetry. It is a class of its own, and it is altogether different from these critics that I spoke right now. It was first published posthumously in 1595 in two separate yet more or less identical editions by two printers. Now, the same thing, the same book, An Apology for Poetry, has been published by two printers and two bears identical names. I'm not going to give you the names because I don't want to confuse you, because the names are actually a little confusing. Please don't get it confused with other works. This is the same. An Apology for Poetry is the work that you are supposed to study. When it was printed by two different printers, it got two separate names or two different names which were identical. One, which was published by William Ponosby, was called The Defense of Poesy, and the other by Henry Olney called it Apology for Poetry. Okay, so one was The Defense of Poesy, the other one was Apology for Poetry, not to be confused with Shelley. Okay, okay. So again, Sidney was greatly. It's the same book in two different titles, published by two different printers, William and Henry. Okay. William published it in the name The Defense of Poesy, and Henry published it as Apology for Poetry, which is the same, Sidney's Apology for Poetry. Okay, all right. Now, Sidney was greatly influenced by the Italian Renaissance writers. Here we have to understand that the Renaissance itself was shrouded in darkness. Sidney is the person who took a bold step to emerge from this medieval darkness into light. He wrote the first treatise on literary theory using the humanistic concepts. One thing we should remember about Sidney's Apology is that even though it is a brilliant work, don't think that it is very original. It is just a synthetic one. It's not exactly original, because Sidney has borrowed ideas in order to convey this defense. See, this essay itself was written when poetry, or when somebody attacked Philip Sidney by writing a scandalous, you can call it a scandalous treatise by Gosson, by a man called, or a person named Stephen Gosson, which was the school of abuse. There he considered poetry, or he made fun of poetry. He in fact indirectly dedicated the school of abuse to Sidney. Okay, he indirectly, unauthorizedly or indirectly dedicated this to Philip Sidney, and there he questioned the morality of poetry and other forms of literature. So Sidney was greatly enraged by this, he was angered by this, and thus he decided to write a treatise or write back a letter, in fact a kind of treatise. Though it is in the form of a letter, it was actually, or it was, you can call it what? You can call it a treatise that spoke about, that argued for poetry, the reasons as to why poetry is much more superior than any other forms of literature. So as I told you, this essay, an apology for poetry by Philip Sidney, is not exactly original. Original in the sense, not original meaning, it was written by him, but it is not completely his original thoughts. It was the thoughts and ideas of Aristotle, of Horace, the great classical writers, and he brings it in such a way brings it to an incredible polish. He has selected and adapted from several other sources also, and all this was done in order to defend his cause, in order to defend as to why poetry is better. It was like a defensive letter written back to Stephen Gosson as to why poetry should be considered better or should be considered superior. Okay. So I think this will do for today, because I don't want to jump into the matter and then scare you. We'll go bit by bit. All right. So we will begin the essay in the next class. So thank you, and this is the background of the historical background, that is of as to why Sidney wrote this letter to, or this essay was as to why Sidney wrote this essay. And in the next or upcoming videos, we shall learn Sidney's defense and Stephen Gosson's abuse. We will also learn Sidney's apology for poetry. He writes apology for poetry. Sidney's view of the antiquity and universality of poetry. Sidney's definition of poetry. Poetry is superior to history and philosophy. The various kinds of poetry. 4 chief objections to poetry. Sidney's review of English poetry and drama, and Sidney's view of poetry in general. Okay, so we shall do that in the upcoming videos. So till then, thank you and keep safe.